welcome to River City Weekly. This week our special guest is screenwriter John Clifford, best known for his work on the eerie thriller Carnival of Souls. I'll be right back after this with John Clifford. Welcome back. Our guest is writer John Clifford, best known for his work on the eerie thriller Carnival of Souls. I asked John how he became a writer.
In the middle of the Depression, I was about 17, I think, 17 going on 18, and I was trying to figure out what am I going to do with my life. I'd been a high school dropout for various reasons I won't go into, and my cousins were all doing difficult jobs in warehouses and loading freight on the docks and railroad docks and so forth. And I was sitting, I lived across the street from Wrigley Field in Chicago, and I was sitting in the back of that apartment reading Robert Benchley. And I set down the book, and I remember, and I went out in the hall, and I stopped, and I thought, they pay him for writing that humor, you know? He makes his living doing that. I don't know why that never occurred to me before, that was a way. And I thought, well, if I can teach myself to write, I won't have to be out there in winter working on the railroad docks and doing these other things, you know. I can live in the world of ideas.
John started out teaching himself how to write jokes.
Because this was still the early days of radio. And all those old vaudevillians, they didn't have material to go week after week, and there weren't that many gag writers around. You know, in the vaudeville days, people had a routine. They'd do it for 20 or 30 years. But in the radio, suddenly they'd go on the air and use up all their material the first day. So you always heard from people I sent to. And finally, I started selling jokes to a comedian named Ken Murray out in Hollywood. He had, I think it was Texaco Star Theater. And I sold my first jokes to Ken Murray.
But even as the work started to come in, it was never easy for him.
I never thought I had a great deal of talent. I just thought I had to work real hard at it. I can remember sitting at the dining room table all day trying to get a paragraph right, you know, writing it over and over and over. And I gradually got kind of used to it, and then I started thinking about short stories, and then I kind of wanted to either write for radio or movies. So eventually, I tried out writing some radio scripts. I invented a radio series, and then I wrote a full-length movie.
With the country on the verge of war, he decided to make a move.
When I was about 20, I inherited a little money from my father's insurance. I think it was about $300, which late in the Depression, $300 was a lot of money, it seemed like. So I knew they had just started the draft, and I had a number in the very first draft. And I knew I wouldn't have too much time. So I thought, well, I'm just going to go to Hollywood and see what I can do. So I remember a cold December night, I got on the old Santa Fe El Capitan and went to Hollywood. And I remember it had been real cold and dark in Chicago. And out there it was sunny, and it was before they had smog, and it smelled of orange blossoms and ocean, sunshine. And there was an agent on Sunset Boulevard, and I guess I looked a lot younger than I was. I mean, I was about 20, 21 then, but I looked about 17, I guess. He thought I was some kind of boy wonder. And so this Hollywood agent signed me to a contract after I was 2 months out there. And he was going to get me a job in the studio as a junior writer. And he was shopping around doing that when the draft board called.
5 years later, John and his new wife found themselves back in Hollywood with a new opportunity to study.
I hadn't graduated from high school, And my wife saw in the paper one day that veterans could get their high school diploma by taking a GED test. That was new then, at Los Angeles City College, I think it was. So I went down there, and they not only gave me the regular GED test, but they gave you occupational tests, and they gave you a comprehension test and different things. And from the career test, they said they thought I ought to be a writer. And they offered to pay my way on the GI Bill to Marin Elwood's Hollywood School for Writers. And so I enrolled there, and I went to a school in Santa Monica where we didn't study anything but writing all day. Analyzed writing and wrote, and people, and it was mostly veterans cooling out. I remember we had an ashtray on every desk. Everybody sat there smoking, put out an ashtray, studying writing. And I did that for a year. And I learned so much technique that I couldn't write anything for about 2 years after I got out of there. But I think when it sunk down in, all these dramatic techniques and everything, I think it probably supported me for the rest of my life.
After completing an English literature degree at Emporia, Clifford came to Lawrence for an opportunity to teach journalism at the old Lawrence High.
I think I got $3,000 a year at that time for being in journalism. I remember they told me I would get an extra $100 a year for being head of the journalism department. So I went to work at the Topeka Daily Capital for a while, and I worked on Topeka Daily Capital. Then I worked for an advertising agency over in Topeka. And then I came over to Centron Films, where I stayed for 23 years.
When we return, John explains the inspiration behind Carnival of Souls. Welcome back. Our guest is Carnival of Souls screenwriter John Clifford. John told me about how the director came up with the idea for the film.
Well, Herc Harvey was driving home from the West Coast, and he was in the evening at the side of Salt Lake City. He saw this strange pavilion sitting out there. Salt Lake had receded, and this thing was standing on stilts out there and had these strange buildings around it. So he drove out there and looked at it. And it was the evening, and it was a huge outdoor ballroom. And I think the biggest one, between the Mississippi and Los Angeles, it turned out that it had been abandoned for years. And he thought it was very creepy. And so when he came back, he and I had discussed feature films and different things. So he came to me and he told me about that. And he said if I could write a script that would kind of end up there with dead people dancing in that old pavilion by the Salt Lake. Some local businessmen had told him that if he ever wanted to make a feature film, they thought they could raise some money. So he said if I'd come up with a script, he thought he could get the money and make a feature film. So I set to work. I was working daytimes, so I set to work in the evenings, and I think in about 3 weeks of evenings and Saturdays, I wrote Carnival of Souls.
Director Herc Harvey offered a few suggestions to help Clifford in his effort.
He talked about maybe being a chase movie of some kind. And he also told me not to write too much dialogue because I guess it was too expensive to shoot all that on the street or something like that. People don't notice, but Carnival is about half silent movie. If it wasn't for the organ score, you'd recognize that. So I thought, okay, he's got that pavilion. That's a good way to save money if I could think of other places like that. And I happen to have been recently in the Reuter Organ Building. I saw that room where they assemble organs. And I thought that'd be a good place to shoot. I thought, well, the heroine could be an organist. And she could have gotten a job in a church at Salt Lake, and that's how she's going to get her to Salt Lake. And that was it. I started with that, and it was one of those experiences where it just kind of unfolded in my mind and in my mental film screen. I just watched it night after night, and wasn't that simple quite, but I just went with what would hold my attention, and what I thought would be a little gripping now and then, and I never thought of having a lot of slaughter in there, or knives. That's probably why it wasn't a bestseller the first time. I don't think I'd have done it anyway. I thought more of a psychological thriller. One thing I remember I decided as a writer was I wouldn't give this heroine any help. Usually a man comes in. If a woman's in trouble in those old films, it's always some fellow comes in and helps her solve her problem. But most of the men in Carnival are heels and slobs. And she doesn't, you never think of this, but she doesn't really get any help. And doctors try to help her, but they don't quite understand either. She never makes contact. I saw her as somebody who isn't making contact with the world anymore. For whatever reason, I leave to your imagination.
And now with script in hand, it was up to Herc Harvey and a crew of only 5 to make a movie out of it.
Herc Harvey was an amazing man. He was accustomed to shooting fast and quick, and he was very organized. He was totally organized. So I don't think anybody else could have made Carnival of Souls but except Herc Harvey. It was budgeted at $30,000, but the actual cash put into the movie was $17,000. That included all the filming, $2,000 for the lead actress. I think the professional cameraman was paid, rented the 35 millimeter camera and the lab, and the whole thing to a print, including editing and all, $17,000. That's impossible, But Herc did the work of 10 men. He was the kind of man I can remember seeing him direct actors all day, and we used to have Hollywood actors here, and for 2-hour shows we used to do sales meetings for oil companies and things. He'd work all day directing these people, shoot dozens and dozens and dozens of shots, and I'd leave the evening, maybe I'd see him sweeping up the studio to make sure the section was clean for tomorrow morning. He was that kind of a fellow. And so he shot it with this crew of 5. He shot Carnival of Souls in something like 3 weeks. Half of it in Lawrence, half of it in Salt Lake City. And they traveled out there. I think they had just a couple of cars, one of which they used to shoot scenes in along the way, and the New York actors packed in along with the crew. That's the way he shot it.
But even after the monumental effort, the finished product met a cool reception.
It was pretty quiet. Herc took it to Hollywood. All we had was one print, and called around. He told me, he called an executive at some studio to ask if he'd see the show, and he says, what was the budget? And Herc said $30,000. And the executive said, I don't look at $30,000 movies. So that was his reception out there. But later, some independent fellow saw it in the lab or something and wanted to sign up. He turned out to be, it was called Hertz Lion, and turned out to be more of a exploitation type of films they were interested in. Carnival wasn't quite that type. So he built it, sent out in a double feature with The Devil's Messenger, which was a bunch of TV shows whipped together with Lon Chaney Jr. doing a little, he must have hired him for an hour to do a narration or something to tie them together. So it wasn't much of a double feature, and it went by pretty fast. We showed it in Lawrence, and young people and kids liked it a lot. I think the adults in Lawrence weren't very impressed. I think I think if we were local people, I've said this before, but I think if we had made a fourth grade Hollywood type film, they'd say, oh yeah, they know what they're doing. But we did something a little different, it baffles people a little bit. And so they don't give you credit for maybe being that original.
But almost 30 years later, it was a much different story.
Somebody had bought the TV rights for 16 years. And so we didn't know it, but people were seeing it, catching it at midnight and 1 or 2 in the morning on TV, which is probably the best time to see it. They weren't expecting much, and they liked it. And it was building up a little following. And sometime in the late 80s, I remember, this book came out, 50 Great Films of the 60s and 70s. And Carnival of Souls was featured. It had, it was one of the 50 greats, according to this fellow. He told me that his son insisted they put that one in because that was his favorite movie. And then Texas Film Festival ran it, and it garnered a lot of attention there. And we were contacted then by a distributor that wanted to distribute again. And amazing thing was, it brought it out a second time, about almost 30 years after it was made, and it played theaters all over the country and was reviewed, in the New Yorker and Village Voice and all the magazines. And one of the New York papers said, I remember nothing less than the best genre film of 1989. So it was just rediscovered.
We'll have more with John Clifford when we return. Welcome back. I asked screenwriter John Clifford about his advice for aspiring writers.
Well, full-time writing, it's very hard to freelance write. Few people succeed at it, but it's very hard to do it freelance. It depends upon your personality. Writing can be a real lonely job, It's like being confined to solitary. You sit at home at your desk writing all day. That aspect of it never appealed to me. That's why I thought I was very lucky to get a job at Centra, because for one thing, usually I'm writing a screenplay, and downstairs in the studio or out around the country sometime, they're shooting the last film I wrote, and probably the one before that is in editing. So people are always running in, consulting with you, and you're always down there talking with people, and so it took the loneliness out of the writer's life. And I like being part of the group and working at Centra. Well, I think it's greatly exaggerated. One of the things I did, I made a serious study of ideation because I realized people are giving me all these films to write, subjects, very poor film subjects sometimes. And I didn't want to always leave it to chance. I wanted to understand. So I kept track of when I solved a problem, how I did it or how I got the idea. Plus, I read people like Edward de Bono, who wrote Lateral Thinking and things like that. And I really studied ideation. One time I wrote a film called How to Get Ideas, as a matter of fact. But what I finally concluded is everybody gets ideas. People, all of us, everybody gets ideas all the time. The trick is to get the idea at the moment in time you need it on a particular subject. But we all solve little problems. We all get an idea of what we're going to do for the children today, or what we're going to do this. It's the same thing. A writer is just use it in a more controlled way, I think, and in more directed. And everybody lives in their imagination, so that's not exclusive. So to me, it's hard work. I don't think for me, writing is not an art, it's a craft. And I'm more concerned about craftsmanship and and how it shaped up.
That's all the time we have for now. Thank you for joining us. If you have questions or comments about the show, you can contact us at rcw@sunflower.com. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week for another River City Weekly.